Welcome to What the F is Going On in Latin America and the Caribbean, CODEPINK's bi-weekly podcast of hot news out of the region. Today's episode, Venezuela, asymmetrical negotiation in the aftermath of January 3rd. Today, we're joined in conversation with my friend and colleague, Leonardo Flores. Leonardo is a founding member of the Venezuela Solidarity Network, and he is also the spokesperson and coalition organizer for the CODEPINK Latin America team. So welcome, Leonardo. Welcome back.
Yeah, thanks so much, Terry. It's really great to be back on WTF, which is now what, and is it 6 years,
Yeah,
roughly?
I think, we started this program on when really the only platform we had was Facebook Live. So
Yeah, I remember, you were working so hard on it, and it's just like the fruits of your labor have paid off so much. It's such an
oh,
incredible
well,
program.
it's been
So
a team
congratulations.
effort. It's been a team effort, and you're part of that team too. But yeah, we've been gradually evolving over the years, and we have our new studio. And the studio is a huge shout out to Kurt Cathbart and Jose Luis Granados of the Soberanía podcast, the Mexican Politics podcast. This is their studio that they've made available. So we have a new look and a new season. So
It looks great.
I'm so happy that you could do this, and I'm really happy to be working with you again. So I guess let me just share with the audience what you and I have talked about and how we want to frame the conversation. And the conversation really, Leonardo and I pretty much want to educate the general population, but also I think a lot of what we're going to have to say today will be very good for those of us who have been in the Venezuela Solidarity movement for many, many years. I think we've got a lot to say to a lot of different demographics in this episode. So today, what I wanted to talk about is what has transpired in Venezuela since the U.S. violently abducted President Maduro and Cilia Flores, on January 3rd. While participating on the February CODEPINK Peace Delegation to Venezuela, we heard about many legislative changes that have raised eyebrows in Venezuela and outside the country. So I'd like us to talk about some of these changes, how and when they were initiated, because that's a huge misunderstanding among many of us. So how and when these changes were initiated, and also the asymmetrical context in which the Venezuelan government is negotiating with the United States and transnational capitalist players. So where should we start with this? The hydrocarbons law, perhaps? Is that or we've heard about the hydrocarbons law, the amnesty law, a little bit in just the grapevine about the anti-hate law. So maybe we should start with the anti-carbon law.
The hydrocarbon law.
Hydrocarbon,
Yeah, so I think
I'm like
if only.
anti-imperialist, I'm sorry.
So, I mean, I think the first thing to understand about this law is that it's a reform of an already existing law. This is the hydrocarbon law that was passed by when Chavez was president in 2002, later modified in 2006. And, one of the things that we're seeing is a lot of kind of fake news and distortions about what this implies. That I think there's been people going all the way to as far as saying that PDVSA is going to be privatized, that the oil is no longer Venezuela's, and the law doesn't say anything of the sort. PDVSA is going to absolutely remain in state hands. The oil remains the property of the Venezuelan people. I think one of the major changes is that the law has to adapt to the actual reality, right? Because the reality in Venezuela right now is much different than it was in 2006. Venezuela has
Definitely.
lived through 10 years of economic warfare. That economic warfare was designed to destroy Venezuela's oil industry, and it was partially successful. And I say partially because Venezuela, prior to January 3rd, had already been increasing steadily its oil production. It hit something like 1.2 billion barrels, million barrels per day back in December. But when we analyze everything that was already happening, say in 2025, well, it was the anti-blockade law that allowed for some of that production to occur. So already, we had already seen when President Maduro was not kidnapped, not a prisoner of war, and still in Venezuela, that the oil laws had already been changed. And it wasn't exactly the hydrocarbon law, but it was the anti-blockade law that allowed for greater investment from foreign capital in Venezuela's oil fields. And the big kind of change, and really one of the most important one, is that there is this concept known as green fields, is what the Venezuelans call it, and that refers to fields where there is proven oil reserves, but those fields are undeveloped. And because Venezuela has heavy crude or extra heavy crude, it requires massive investment from the start to get those fields going. And the reality is that because of the sanctions, countries couldn't come in and invest. Now those sanctions are being, I don't even want to say partially lifted, because what we're seeing are general licenses and exceptions, but foreign capital can come in now, but they need an incentive to do so. And so the Venezuelan government is taking steps to ensure that those incentives are there so that these oil fields can be developed.
So, now, oh boy, that leads to several questions. So the green fields, where are those? Orinoco Belt, am I correct in that? And there was
Yeah,
one location.
for the most part, they're in the Orinoco belt. I mean, there is already, fields that are developed in that belt, but there's many more proven reserves that haven't been exploited yet there.
So, and then regarding foreign investment, Chevron has never left Venezuela. They chose to play the long game. They kept their investments. They haven't necessarily done any capital improvements or upgrades, but they've kept their operations under special licenses. Other oil companies have left, including Exxon. And so, what is it going to take for them to come back? I mean, they're looking at making an enormous capital investment, and I hate having this like total capitalist business conversation, but it's the reality of what's happening in this moment. Um, and they're going to want a fairly rapid return on investment, which is probably not likely given
Yeah,
the
I mean,
infrastructure.
yeah, you're right. And I think, for one, I don't think Exxon will return to Venezuela because Exxon wanted the changes in this law to go much further. In fact, I think if you remember, I think back in the first week or week and a half in January, a few days after the attack and kidnapping, Trump held this kind of roundtable discussion with transnational oil companies and their executives. And Chevron was pretty adamant that Exxon was pretty adamant that they needed to see basically a change in Venezuela's constitution. And that really plays into the fact that Exxon's been after regime change in Venezuela for decades now, since 2006, actually, when they left. So I don't see them coming back. And yes, there are already negotiations with other companies that want to re-enter Venezuela's market or enter it. I don't think that in those green fields that the profits are going to be quick in coming, because this takes a lot of initial investment and time. But, the world isn't moving away from oil anytime soon, so the profits will come eventually. It's certainly not going to be anything fast. I know the Trump administration is selling it as like it's going to be something that's going to occur overnight, but that's not the case. I think, what might occur overnight is that some of these companies that were really forbidden from continuing investment and upgrading already existing infrastructure might be able to do that if under new licenses, and then that could boost production in already existing fields. And let me just mention one more point before I forget, because people are criticizing this law without really knowing what it's about and saying that, oh, the Venezuelans are selling out their oil when that's really not the case. And it really should be contrasted with the proposal put forth by Maria Corina Machado. And her proposal was a total privatization not just of Venezuela's oil, but all of Venezuela's energy and minerals. She was promising like trillions of dollars to US corporations. And what we're seeing the Venezuelan government do is not at all what she was proposing. And in fact, the energy secretary was in Venezuela about a month ago. What's his name? Chris Wright. And he said, among other things, he said that he wasn't really happy with the law because it didn't go far enough. And yet that's the law that exists, right? So already we see some kind of tensions and points of negotiation between the US and the Venezuelan government.
So you mentioned Exxon may possibly not returning. They've been in and out of Venezuela twice already, I believe. And they would want, and I believe they're not the only transnational corporation that would want a constitutional change, but they want a full government change as well. They want, and this is very historical in U.S. intervention in Latin America and the Caribbean, that those corporations, Guatemala probably is the best example in '54, the corporations want a government that is completely on board with them and that will give them the constitutional rights, legal rights, to do what they need and want to do, which is basically turning, countries into full colonies of the United States or more colonies of transnational corporations. Guatemala was a perfect example of that with United Fruit, using the government and U.S. military to get exactly what they wanted for their corporation. And I think a lot of people may think of that when they think about what may possibly be going on in Venezuela, and I would argue that is most definitely not what's going to happen in Venezuela.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And then in terms of Exxon, when you look at what Exxon is doing to Guyana, where they basically forced them to accept, and not forced, but like bribed, like a government that really knew nothing about oil and oil contracts to accept a set of terms that are far below the international standards, and they're basically thieving oil from Guyana and trying to, cause a crisis between Guyana and Venezuela and these unexplored waters off the Essequibo. That to me is much more alarming than anything, than any kind of claims that Venezuela is somehow losing, giving away its sovereignty because of this particular oil law, which I don't really see it that way. And we have to understand that Venezuela's sovereignty was already kind of violated by this economic warfare, by the unilateral coercive measures, by the sanctions. And so this is not exactly, a step backward, I would say, necessarily for Venezuela. It may be a step to the side. It certainly isn't progress, right? But it's not any worse than the sanctions that the Venezuelan people have already been living through.
Well, and it may be, I mean, I hate to use the word compromise, but it may be the path to work around the sanctions and return to a pre-sanction relationship between the two countries, which people don't, we don't talk about that enough, that there was actually diplomatic and business relationships before 2014, 2015, pretty strong ones, historic ones.
Yeah, absolutely. Venezuela has always been a major supplier of oil to the United States until the Trump administration stopped that. And we should also note that, there are still warships outside of Venezuela,
Exactly.
right? And so, like,
And they went
people,
into Ecuador yesterday.
yeah, they did. And so people complaining about Venezuela, selling out their oil don't really take into account the fact that they're still being threatened.
Yeah, exactly. So let's talk a little bit about where the Venezuela government is sitting right now in relationship to the United States, because I specifically chose to use the word asymmetric in titling today's episode, because I really believe that that's what's happening. I don't know how you could really describe it anywhere else. And it's my personal feeling is, and having recently been there, but having been there so many times since 2005 as well, as you know, and I think the government deserves a huge round of applause for holding the country together. It's incredibly stable, on the streets. In Caracas, especially, incredibly stable on the streets. It's peaceful. People are going about their daily business. I'm not sure how much more you could ask for after having your country invaded on January 3rd. I mean, it was a military invasion. There were bombs and kidnappings, and yeah, it was not just a simple, abduction of the president. It wasn't.
Yeah, and I think the Chavistas themselves are talking about this asymmetry in the negotiations because they obviously are facing a nuclear power that has much more economic force than they do, and not in addition to the military force, which we've already talked about. But we also really have to understand kind of what the goals of, say, the U.S. government and the Venezuelan government are. And for the U.S. part, they talk about three things. They talk about stabilization, recovery, meaning economic recovery, and then transition. And two of those three are just kind of ridiculous because those things were already happening, right? Venezuela was
Exactly.
already stable. We
Exactly.
had an outbreak of political violence in 2024 following the elections, but I think that lasted around 3 days,
Yeah.
compared to, say, the 4 or 5 months of political violence in 2017, the entire year of uncertainty in 2019 with the Guaido situation. So Venezuela was already pretty stable. Um, in terms of recovery, Venezuela had, prior to this attack, I think we were about to enter 5 straight years of economic growth. So there was really a sense that the economy had already hit rock bottom, and that because of how the Venezuelan government eventually their policies, they were able to start growing again. And part of that policy was, of course, was the anti-blockade law. Another big part was really spurring the production of food, particularly from the communes. So Venezuela becomes self-sufficient in food. So two of those three objectives from the United States government are really kind of fake because they're like things that are already occurring. The
Exactly.
third one is
Yeah.
the transition. And there's been absolutely no indication by the United States that they are pushing for elections anytime soon. And in fact, the even the opposition is saying, well, that this presidential term, or members of the opposition at least, are saying that this presidential term is going to be totally fulfilled, meaning that the next elections, I guess, think would be in 2030, if I'm not.
2030. Yeah, they were July of
Yeah, so
2024. So yeah.
so there is nothing to suggest that there's going to be some sort of a political transition. And then on the Venezuelan side, they talk about three objectives as well. First one is peace.
Yeah.
We've had now 2 months of peace. And, people might say, oh, well, what's that really worth if the United States is controlling the sale of Venezuelan oil? Well, it's worth a lot. And I think all we have to do is look at what's happening to the Iranian people right now, who are being carpet bombed in Tehran, right?
Yeah.
That's not what any Venezuelan wants. I think the fact that the government of interim President Delcy Rodriguez putting such an emphasis on defending peace is really praiseworthy. And she's had to sit down with some of the most horrible people in the world to achieve this peace, to maintain this peace, including the director of the CIA. And Delcy Rodriguez, her father, was kidnapped and murdered basically at the orders of the CIA.
You're right.
So for her personally, and she's spoken about this, it was an incredibly difficult thing to do, but she did it for the sake of the nation. The second point, the objective of the Venezuelan government is freedom, the liberation of President Nicolás Maduro and First Lady Cilia Flores. There, obviously, that has not been achieved, but there is an international movement calling for their release. And people in Venezuela are mobilizing constantly, calling for their release. Obviously, the Venezuelan government has no power in that other than to, push for international solidarity, which they're doing. And then the third point, which is very important, is to maintain the Bolivarian revolution in power, in government, and not just for the sake of being in power, but to protect the working classes of Venezuela.
Yeah.
Because we absolutely know what the fascists are offering for Venezuela, and that's basically hate and massacres and violence.
It's basically a return to being serfs. They'd like to see us all be serfs.
Yeah.
So you mentioned hate, and I know there's not a lot. There's a lot of, well, actually, there's not a lot of firm data about this, but we're seeing a lot floating around on social media about the anti-hate law. What can you tell us about that? Or
Well,
dispel about that, maybe?
sure,
More
but let's talk
important.
about the amnesty law first, because that
Okay.
one can kind of lead into this hate law.
Okay, perfect.
And so, a couple of weeks ago, the Venezuelan National Assembly approved this amnesty law for democratic coexistence. And what this does, and it's through this law, I think there's already been something like 245 people released from prison, another 5,500 or so people who had what's known as precautionary measures, which might be either parole or a travel ban or you're having your assets frozen. All of those were lifted. And so this amnesty law relates to political violence in 13 kind of series of events going back to 2002. So it's political violence relating to the 2002 coup, the 2002-2003 strike and oil sabotage, the 2004 recall referendum. And I'm mentioning all these events because there was political violence
Yeah.
associated with them,
No,
right-wing
exactly.
political violence, right?
Well, 2002 was an overt overthrow.
Exactly. The 2002 US-backed coup. Then there was more violent protests in 2007, 2009, 2013 after the passing of, not after the passing of President Chavez, but after the first election of President Maduro. 2014 when there was an attempted color revolution. 2017 where there's another attempted color revolution. 2019 after the Juan Guaido thing. 2023, 24, and 25. So, this really
Well,
shows how violent Venezuela's fascists have been over the years. And this is an incredible gesture of, not just of forgiveness, but of attempting to construct a deep and lasting peace. And it's really important to emphasize a couple of more things about this law. One is that President Maduro was already in favor of it. In fact, in the week before his kidnapping, he had released 200 people from prison or from prison and from these precautionary measures. He had done the same thing last year. And so this was kind of an ongoing project of ensuring that it was only the most violent people who were still in prison, the ones who had actually like hurt people and not people who got caught up in protests, which happened quite a bit, particularly after the 2024 elections. So Maduro was already on board with not only with this, but going back to the hydrocarbon discussion with that as well, because he was the one who pushed for this anti-blockade law, right? Which is
yes.
part of what this hydrocarbon reform is based on. And the amnesty law excludes certain things. It excludes major criminal acts, so like say homicide or drug trafficking or major acts of corruption. It
Or calling
excludes
to overthrow the government.
exactly. It excludes
Or
crimes
burning
against
people alive.
yeah, and I want to talk about that specifically. It
Yeah.
excludes crimes against humanity. It excludes armed actions or financing people to take up arms against the state or its people. And so, in all of these exclusions, one big name rings out: is Maria Corina Machado going to receive amnesty? And the answer is no, she is certainly not, because she's called for sanctions, because she's called for an invasion, because she's been implicated in plot after plot. So she and some of her the most fascist people in Venezuela, who are really exiles now, are not contemplated under this amnesty law. And something really kind of interesting and really beautiful, I thought, happened a couple of weeks ago was that Delcy Rodriguez, the interim president, had this meeting that was broadcast live on TV. And at the meeting were some of the victims of this fascist violence, including Inés Esparragosa, who's the mother of Orlando Figuera, who you alluded to. Orlando Figuera in 2017, so first of all, he was a poor young black man who was coming home from work, I believe, and he was walking through a very rich part of Caracas, Las Mercedes, a very rich, very white part. And this was in the middle of the attempted color revolution. And, right-wing thugs saw him on the street and they doused him in gasoline, set him on fire, and proceeded to stab him multiple times. And eventually he died of his wounds. I mean, it was horrible. It was one of the most shocking racist attacks in Venezuela ever. And unfortunately, he wasn't the only one. They set multiple people on fire that year. Um, Also present at this meeting was Zoraida Bravo. She's the mother of a captain in the National Guard, Ramsor Bracho Bravo, who was murdered by anti-government thugs in 2014. And both of these mothers spoke directly to the president and talking to them about how they felt about this amnesty law and what they were afraid of. And Zoraida Bravo, I mean, I'm gonna share this clip with you later, Terry, because it's really fascinating what she says. She says that when Michelle Bachelet came to Venezuela to investigate the so-called human rights abuses, that on her list of political prisoners were the two men who killed her son, who murdered her son. And she brought this up to her and she said, "Have you even looked at their case files?" And she said no. And so this really debunks a lot of the
Yeah,
UN's work in Venezuela,
completely.
because they didn't look, they didn't, they may have like talked to the victims briefly, but they didn't look into their claims. And guys who murdered captain of the National Guard are somehow portrayed as political prisoners when obviously they're not, they're murderers. But both of these women supported the amnesty law. There was some concern about the hate law. And so the hate law is in Venezuela has been used, sometimes it has been abused and people have gone to prison when they should not have. And so certainly in those cases, I think the amnesty law is going to take over. But I think there's still an open discussion about what to do with the hate law, because in this meeting that I told you about with the victims and with President Delcy Rodriguez, one of the things that she really emphasized was the need to overcome the hate that has been polarizing Venezuela for the past 20 some years and to stop this fascist violence. And so we'll see what happens with the hate law, but I think there's concern around the grassroots that's going to expose them. I mean, Soraya Bravo, this woman who lost her son who was killed, she was telling this horrible stories about how she lives kind of in an opposition building, and that because she was so adamant in finding justice for her son's killers, that her neighbors kind of turned on her. And in 2019, where there was that massive blackout, February 2019, that Marco Rubio tweeted about instantly, she said that her neighbors wouldn't let her get water from the shared water resources, and that at different points the corner store wouldn't let her buy corn flour, which is used to make arepas. And so she personally was very concerned about, what would happen to her if this hate law is rescinded and she no longer feels protected from it. But at the same time, there certainly have been abuses. So I think that's an ongoing conversation with the government, with the opposition, and with the grassroots to see what can be done to overcome the hate that's been pervading Venezuela.
So there's two things that, in talking about possibly repatriating some of the opposition people who live outside of Venezuela. My understanding is that they will have to apply for amnesty or to come back, and their individual cases will be reviewed. And, I personally don't see this as significantly different than what Daniel Ortega did after the Contraror to rebuild a citizenry within Nicaragua. There are those people who are never going to be able to desire peace and work. And I think that's that very small, violent, U.S.-backed demographic of the opposition. Not all the Venezuelan opposition are like that. I mean, their politics are different, their economic model is different, but they believe in constitutional change, and a lot of them form political parties, run candidates, and participate constitutionally to force change. But unfortunately, the really wealthy, violent ones are the ones backed by the U.S. But there has to be some way of rebuilding a nation, and I don't think anybody could or should negate the government's attempt to do that. I mean, it's a nation of Venezuelans who want to unite and move forward, and I think some being ununited for so long has been, in a way, just as detrimental as the sanctions have been, the lack of unity as a nation of people. And to me, being on the streets late last February, a lot of that has gone away in the mixed neighborhoods. I mean, there's like the women living among the opposition that are violent. That will probably never change, but that demographic exists in many, many places across the planet, unfortunately. But there's a vast majority, just in my own personal experience, eating out, walking the streets, going to parks, people are interfacing with each other as citizens in a peaceful manner. And I think that's a huge testament to Delcy Rodriguez and her government.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think this attack on January 3rd could have set off a really crazy chain of events, right? Because it's not like they were only looking to kidnap President Maduro. They wanted to break the revolution. They wanted to cause strife and chaos in Venezuela. They wanted either a civil war or a military uprising or opposition protesters on the street. And none of that happened. The people who took to the
No.
street were the Chavistas calling for peace, calling for the return of President Maduro and Cilia Flores. And when we look at this amnesty law, we also have to understand that President Chavez was the first to grant amnesty
Yes.
to some of the key people involved in the 2002 coup. He was criticized for that by some members of the left, in Venezuela internationally. But I think it really pointed to this idea of what you said, unity. And Chavez famously, among his last words, was this unity, 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 unidad, unidad, unidad. And he was speaking directly to the Bolivarian Revolution. But I think there's also a need for greater unity, and President Rodriguez touched on that. The interim president touched on that in this press conference I was telling you about, where she said, "Look, after this attack that affected all of the country, we need national unity, and this amnesty bill is a step towards that. It's a step towards reconciliation within Venezuelans themselves." And just as one last point, I have been talking about this hate that's been kind of pervading Venezuela, but so much of it is fomented abroad, right? So in the 2024 aftermath of the 2024 elections, there was a massive kind of disinformation campaign on social media led by bots that were being operated from abroad, talking about supposed major human rights violations or crimes committed by the Venezuelan government that had no basis in truth at all. And what they were designed to do was to cause anger among the Venezuelan opposition and put them out onto the streets and have them do crazy things. And unfortunately, we saw some really kind of emblematic examples of that. And so hopefully, I think that the fact that so much of this discourse comes from abroad, I think it has to be tackled by the Venezuelan government in some way.
Well, it's a enormous project, but it's very. I mean, there's no excuse for what the U.S. has done, and in my lifetime, it's done nothing but intervention in Latin America and the Caribbean, which has spurred so much of our work, and it's. But it is very. I've said this multiple times in our conversation that it's very impressive and how stable the country is and how peaceful it is. And I think that's so important for people outside Venezuela to understand that it's not, there's no civil war on the brink of, breaking out. I think people are moving forward. And I think, and it's a real testament to Delcy Rodriguez, but also to the Venezuelan people, to the nation, that this is happening. I don't know, many people who would move forward in such a peaceful manner. When we were in Venezuela last month, there was one thing that was mentioned to the delegation, that January 3rd was the first time Venezuela had suffered an external attack in 200 years. I mean, so that's a testament to the nation as a whole, and how shocking and horrifying January 3rd was to people. People are still suffering, post-traumatic stress syndrome in May for many, many years. The bombs and the noise and the destruction and the kidnapping of a democratically elected president. It's all very traumatic stuff.
It is, and I also really want to emphasize that the warships are still there. There could be another
Yeah.
attack, right? I mean,
Right. Yeah.
I've seen this metaphor on social media over and over again that Delcy has a gun to her head. The gun's not just to her head. The gun's to the head of the Venezuelan people.
Yeah. The
And
whole
so
nation.
when you
Yeah.
see her, yeah, when you see her or the government, accepting these, visits from these awful Trump administration people, we have to understand the context. And it's the context is it's not just Delcy that's under threat of being killed or kidnapped. It's the entire population under threat of a U.S. war.
Yeah, exactly. And just because the one aircraft carrier left the Caribbean doesn't mean they're.
That's right.
So, in the last couple minutes, can you share with the audience two projects, two campaigns that Code Pink's working on right now? The International Workers' Women Day campaign in support of Cilia Flores, and the congruence on Cuba, the big
Convergence.
caravan.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So Code Pink, part of the delegation, one of the things that Code Pink was told was that we really want you all to take kind of a leading role in solidarity for Cilia Flores because she's going kind of under the radar. Because obviously a lot of the attention has been focused on President Maduro. And Cilia Flores herself is a woman with a very long trajectory in the Bolivarian Revolution. She was Hugo Chavez's lawyer way back in 1992 when he was imprisoned. She's been, a member of the National Assembly. She was the first woman to be the president of the National Assembly. She was the first woman to be the Solicitor General. She managed President Maduro's first electoral campaign. She's a current member of the National Assembly, so she's a sitting deputy who's been kidnapped. And at Code Pink, we are trying to amplify this call for solidarity with Cilia and for the freedom of Cilia. You can check out our statement that we have. That's a sign-on statement aimed at particularly organizations and particularly at feminist organizations, but anyone can sign. You can find it at codepink.org/freecilia. That's CILIA. And then the project is this Convergence on Cuba, which I'm very happy to be going to Cuba for the first time as part of this convergence. And it's because of the Trump administration's awful blockade. They've been blocking oil going to Cuba since early December when those U.S. warships decided to intercept Venezuelan oil tankers and other tankers coming to trade in Venezuelan oil. And this is causing despair and quite a bit of suffering among the Cuban population. And it's a crime against humanity, basically, what the Trump administration is doing. And I think that people in the United States, one of the best ways we can show our solidarity with the Cubans, in addition to doing the political work of organizing here on the ground to take power, is to give material aid to try to ease some of that suffering and to also highlight what the Trump administration is doing to Cuba. And that's a big part of this convergence where we're teaming up with the People's Forum and Progressive International and many other organizations to be in Havana on March 21st when a flotilla is going to be arriving carrying not just humanitarian aid, but solar panels. And so we're really highlighting this energy crisis that is entirely manufactured by the Trump administration.
Wow, two great projects. And so happy to have you back on the team to help coordinate and lead them.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Just coordinating. I don't know that I'm leading them.
It's really great. I just, in listening to you describe Cuba and also, mentioning that the U.S. fleet is still in the Caribbean, what we're seeing in the Caribbean is to me, and I think to you, many of us would just see as the same project by the same people for the same reasons that we've seen in Gaza, that we saw in Syria and Cuba for 60 plus years. It's the same project. And I think it's really important that we all understand, that a lot of what we've witnessed in Gaza, Latin America is the intersection of so much of that. And so these projects are great. I'm so glad that you're going to Cuba. Thank you for sharing those projects with the audience. And I hope that you can come back. And it was a great conversation and very helpful to me, and I'm sure many of the listeners as well.
Thanks so much, Terry. I'd love to be back on WTF.
Okay. And welcome to our new studio.
It's beautiful. I like it.
Okay, thank you again. So happy to have this conversation.
Thank you.